Okay, guys, so let's continue what we started this morning in the lobby. It was a little strange, so I complained. So hopefully, well, it was fun, but hopefully it won't be reproduced again. So hopefully next week we'll have our G10 room back so we can teach properly. So I hope you had a good day. So what we're going to do is basically continue what we started, and this is where we were. This is just a recap slide because we ended with this one, but I spent so much time making those crazy animation that I just want to share it with you again. So here we go. So this is the abdominal aorta. So the first unpaired branch that you will see on the entire aspect of the abdominal aorta will be the celiac trunk. So just like a tree, a trunk will give branches. So the first one was the left gastric that will basically feed the upper part of the lesser curvature of the stomach. And this one will anastomose with the right gastric that is basically coming from the proper hepatic, most of the time from the proper or sometimes from the common hepatic. And then you have the splenic artery that is basically the squiggly one that will follow the body and the tail of the pancreas. So from your common hepatic, you will also have the gastroduodenal artery that will basically be responsible of feeding both the duodenum but also to give the right gastromental artery that will anastomose with the left gastromental artery to feed the greater curvature of the stomach. So from this gastroduodenal artery, you will have the superior pancreatical duodenal artery that will basically divide in anterior and the posterior. So both going on each side of the head of the pancreas and the duodenum. So this encircles the entire head and neck of the pancreas, and they will anastomose with the inferior pancreatical duodenal artery coming from the second unpaired branch of the abdominal aorta, the superior mesenteric artery. So this here, the celiac trunk, is responsible of feeding the entire foregut here, whereas the superior mesenteric will be responsible of feeding the midgut that we'll describe in more detail in the next lecture, if I'm not mistaken. And since you see that here, the head, the neck, the uncinate process of the pancreas is all receiving its blood supply from the pancreatical duodenal arteries, what about the tail and the body of the pancreas? They will receive their pancreatic branches from the squiggly splenic artery that travels along its upper border. So that's what we described this morning. And now we stop when we started talking about the liver. So the liver, since you all had Fiji classes, no need to tell you that the liver is the primary site of filtration, basically, to detoxify all the substance and the blood that is actually coming from the GI, which makes sense because like you don't want the filthy blood coming from your GI to be returned immediately to your systemic circulation. You want it to be filtered in order to absorb all the nutrients and basically stock them, store the vitamins, store the minerals, store whatever you need before returning it back to the circulation. So where is it located exactly? So the liver is located here in your right hypochondrium region, but also extend on the epigastric region. And sometime you will see it also on the other contralateral side, which is on your hypochondriac, your left hypochondriac region. So there's as many shape liver shape as there is fingerprints. So you'll see in the lab that all the livers are fairly different. They all have different features, a different shape, and you'll notice how heavy they are. So they're a filled organ, right? They're a filled organ. They're really heavy. They're filled of blood. And the only thing that is almost constant throughout the different livers are their imprints. So since they are closely related to the other organs, you can see when you look on the posterior aspect on the visceral surface, so on the inferior posterior aspect of the liver, you will see imprints made by other adjacent organs. So if you look on the left posterior aspect of your liver, you will see an imprint for the stomach, which is located right here. And then you also have your esophagus that will leave an imprint. But what is more stunning is on the right side, where you have your kidney. So the renal imprint will be located on the upper lateral right side of your liver, and then you have your hepatic flexure of your colon. So your ascending colon will basically arise here and then will bifurcate before becoming your transverse colon, leaving a little imprint, the colic imprint, which is right here. So look at the liver. You'll see in the lab how heavy it is, and it will be kind of surprising to you how it is basically supported by the diaphragm, right? So the liver is an intraperitoneal organ, so meaning that it floats in the peritoneal cavity, encased in the peritoneum layers, right? So the visceral layer, oh wow, okay, let's do it again. So here, so if you remove the liver from the posterior abdominal wall, you see that the parietal peritoneum basically folds over and become the visceral peritoneum that will encase the liver. But it does not encase it all, just like the stomach, for example. There's a region that is called the bare area, so area nuda, which means it's not covered by the peritoneum at all. So the liver is in direct contact with the diaphragm. So bare of peritoneum, so naked region, not covered. And this here, when you look at it, you have a folding. The peritoneum, the parietal peritoneum folding to become the visceral will create a folding, just like the hilum of the lungs. So you'll see that this is a thicker ligament called the posterior coronary ligament. And you also have the same thing on the anterior aspect right here, which is the anterior coronary ligament. So I'm not sure if you remember, but coronary means crown, right? So it forms a crown around the bare area where you have the folding of the peritoneum, so parietal becoming the visceral, thickening, making a strong anchor to the liver, hanging from the diaphragm, right? And when you look at the two corners right here, so you have a folding of the posterior, you have a folding of the anterior coronary ligaments, so it forms a thicker region on both sides, and these are called the triangular ligaments. So you'll see that this here entire system basically suspend the liver from the diaphragm right here. And the other thing that you can notice is this thing here, which is the anterior attachment of the liver to the anterior abdominal wall. So you have your visceral peritoneum that will fold and meet the parietal peritoneum of the anterior abdominal wall. So it creates another anchor to the anterior abdominal wall here, the falciform. Falciform comes from falx, so it's basically a separation of the peritoneum that will be right here. It's standing down to what we call the ligamentum teres. No need to, remember that this is a remnant, embryological remnant. So you have this ligamentum teres, this round ligament right here that will be extended from your falciform ligament. So is there something else to add? So lesser omentum, oh yeah, so the lesser omentum, you need to remember that the lesser omentum will connect the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach that will be just hanging here. Here we go. Good. We'll describe this a little more in more detail. But the only thing that I want you to remember is that the lesser omentum is basically also responsible of enclosing what we call the portal triad. So you need a system that will anchor the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach to make sure that, for example, the bile duct and the arteries, so the proper hepatic artery and the portal vein, do not get stretched when you breathe, when you digest, when you're moving, to make sure that the stomach remains almost always, not the stomach, but the duodenum stays almost always at the same position. So not stretching those important vessels. So this is the hepatoduodenal ligament, which is a thickening containing all those vessels, part of the lesser omentum, which connects the lesser curvature of the stomach to the liver. Good. So if we look at the liver like this, so you can probably see that the falciform ligament divides the anterior aspect of the liver in two big lobes, right? So you have your right lobe, which is like usually more prominent, and your left lobe that will extend from the epigastric region to your left hypochondrium region. So this is divided by the falciform ligament. But if you look at the lateral, the posterior side, or the visceral perspective, the visceral side, you can notice that you also have two other lobes. So you have your right, you have your left, but you also have two lobes that are separated by what we call the porta hepatis, which is basically the liver's hilum, right? All the vessels that are actually entering, the veins that are leaving, but also the hepatobiliary tree that will leave this region, this hilum, right? So you have your falciform ligament that will be here, that behind will be called the ligamentum venosum, right here, and then you have your porta hepatis. So on the posterior side, you have your caudate lobe. So it's called caudate because caudate means tail, so it means that it has a little tail right between your ligamentum venosum and your inferior vena cava, forming a little lump here, which is a tail, so caudate lobe. And on the anterior aspect, which you don't see here, but you will see that between your gallbladder, for example, and your ligamentum teres, you will have a more square-looking lobe, which is your quadrate lobe. So all those lobes are anatomic lobes, so they're not functional lobes. They're just described because they are separated by different structures. So they appear to be like a different lobes. But if you, whoops, I just clicked on camera, sorry. So here, so if you look at a more descriptive way to describing the liver, you can, this is extra material and don't worry about it. But surgically, each lobes can be subdivided in what we call segmental lobes. So they are all individually functional, right? So they all receive their blood supply, they all receive their veins, they all receive their hepatobiliary system. So during surgery, if one lobe is affected by a tumor or a pathology, it can be, not easily, but it can be resected from the others because they are independent. So this is another way of a more functional way of describing the liver. But don't remember those 8 segments. It's not necessary. So we described the porta hepatis, which was basically the border between the quadrate and the caudate lobes. So here, don't be mistaken, right? So now we're looking at the liver, still from the visceral point of view, but you need to notice that here the caudate is now on the other side, meaning that we flip the liver. So the posterior aspect, so posterior, just a quick way to remember it. So posterior, your tail, the tail of a horse, the tail of a cat is posterior, right? So the posterior lobe will be the caudate, and the quadrate will be in front. So when you look at the porta hepatis here, which is between the quadrate and the caudate lobes, you can actually notice that there's several, well, the 3 structures are, you have your hepatic arteries, you also have your portal vein, which will drain the entire GI blood to get filtered by the liver, but you also have your right and left hepatic ducts, which are part of the hepatobiliary tree. So these structures are the one that will be contained in the hepatoduodenal ligament, which is the thick part of the lesser omentum that anchors right here, this part of the liver, to the duodenum. So you can notice that this is the lesser curvature, lesser omentum is all here, and when we're doing dissection, we can actually easily pass through this layer here because it's not mechanically strong, but here, because it's containing those structures, it's way thicker. So we need to actually resect it in order to expose those vessels because it has a mechanical function to anchor those structures from the liver to the rest of the small intestine. So it's way thicker. So all this is the lesser omentum. The thicker part here containing those 3 structures is called the hepatoduodenal because it connects the liver to the duodenum and it's a ligament in itself. So it's part of the lesser omentum, but it's distinctly described as the hepatoduodenal ligament. I'm not sure if it makes sense. I don't see you, but oh, here we go. I hope that you understand this concept. You'll see it in the lab, and hopefully if you have any questions, we can address it like, well then. Good. So now we saw the different lobes, the folding of the peritoneum on top of the liver. So now let's nourish the liver. Let's bring the blood supply. So let's go back to our abdominal aorta. Celiac trunk again. You recognize the squiggly splenic artery, the left gastric artery, and bingo, now we're seeing the third and the last branch of the celiac trunk, which is the common hepatic artery. So common, why common? Just because it's vague, it's commonly going towards the liver, but it will give other branches before being precisely going to the liver. This is why it's called the common hepatic artery. So that's the one that will give the proper hepatic artery after it gives the gastroduodenal artery. So you have your common hepatic artery, gastroduodenal artery. So as soon as this one arises from the common hepatic artery, you have another one that will head towards the liver, and that will be properly designed for the liver. So it's proper hepatic artery. And since you saw, we have like two major, bigger lobes, the right and the left. You will have two sub-arteries coming from your proper hepatic artery. So the right and the left hepatic arteries. So this is the celiac trunk. So no need to go crazy. So when we first mentioned it, I think it was probably like overwhelming and intimidating, but just memorize this schematic. Pretty simplistic, and I think that they are pretty descriptive. So they tell you exactly where they are going. So good. So the venous system here. The vein is a little different than the other structures of the GI, because the liver will receive the portal system. It will receive the filthy blood from the entire GI, will filter it, and then it needs to return it to the systemic circulation, right? So therefore, the veins of the liver will be called the hepatic vein, that will bring the entire blood filtered by the liver back to the inferior vena cava for the systemic circulation. So you will see that, I'm not sure if we see it in another slide, but, oh, too many animations. So here, you see that the liver is basically buried and encircling the inferior vena cava. So it will have three hepatic veins that will basically drain the filtered blood back to the systemic circulation. Here we go. Perfect. Do I have something else to add here? No, I don't think so. Good. So that's it for the liver. So the other associated structure to the liver is the gallbladder, which is part of the biliary system. So the hepatoduodenal biliary system, or extra hepatic biliary system. So this is basically a system that will collect the bile secreted by the liver, and that can be stored to the gallbladder or excreted to the GI, to the second part of the duodenum. So remember that it will meet with the pancreas and will excrete into the second portion of the duodenum. So when you look at your liver, this is the porta hepatis here, that basically is represented by this dark line here. You will also have two hepatic ducts. So you'll have the right and the left hepatic duct that will basically exit the porta hepatis and will join and merge to form the common hepatic duct. So common because you have two joining together forming the common hepatic duct. And then here you have two options. So this can either go to the common bile duct, so bile because it's not necessarily coming from the liver, but it can also come from the cystic duct where it leads to the gallbladder. So you can imagine that bile is like secreted all day, so when you don't need it, so the bile will just flow down to the common hepatic, and then when it will merge here. So when the papilla is closed, it can actually flow back and enter into your gallbladder. So the gallbladder is a storage space for bile. So when you don't need it, you store it there. When you need it and you need more than what the liver is capable of secreting, you will just contract your gallbladder and have more bile excreted into your GI. So think about it. So common hepatic duct, junction of your hepatic ducts. Makes sense? So it's commonly, they're both coming from the liver. But here it's called common bile duct because the bile can either come from the liver but also from your gallbladder. So common bile duct, don't be mistaken, right? Hepatic, common hepatic from your hepatic ducts, common bile duct because bile can be coming from either your cystic duct connecting to the gallbladder or from your common bile duct. And then you recognize our little ampulla of Vater, so hepatopancreatic ampulla that will be right here. So papilla can be open, excreting, or closed, flowing back. Good, perfect. Gallbladder, really simple. So the gallbladder is basically just a sac, right? It's just a little sac that stores bile. So just like the stomach, so you'll have like a distended part, which will be the fundus. You also have the body, but here instead of having a pyloric region, you'll have a neck, which is like getting more narrow before becoming the cystic duct. So that's it for the gallbladder. And just a little thing to add here is that from the right hepatic artery, right here, you'll have a little branch that will extend and vascularize the gallbladder. So again, all those tiny little branches here, you also have the right gastric artery. So they are described in this course the way they are usually found, but there's so many variations. Don't be mistaken if you see another variation in the lab, because like it happens so often that these branches are just coming from where they can, and where they come from where they want. It doesn't really matter. So this is just like the statistically what we see the most. That's it. Hepatic artery, right, and cystic artery. Good, perfect. I think this is the last organ that we wanted to describe today, which is the spleen. So the spleen is part of the vascular system, but also it has like a lymphatic role, right? It's there to filter blood. So if we look at your diaphragm, right, you see the two domes, so the right and the left. You see that the liver basically like fits perfectly under the right aspect of your diaphragm. And on the left dome, you have your spleen. So the spleen is therefore located in your left hypochondriac region, really adjacent to your liver and right behind your stomach, which is right here. So it's also protected by ribs, the ribs number, well, the last rib 9, 10, and 11. So it needs to be protected because it's a vascular organ, right? It's filled with blood. So you don't want it to be exposed and damaged easily because like it could be pretty devastating. So when you look, if we just isolate it, oh, look at this animation. This is great. So here, so this is the spleen. So a good way to recognize what is anterior and posterior on the spleen is that the anterior border will always be the notched border. So it's always filled with dents, right? It's all indented right here. And you will see that in the central aspect, you still have a hilum, so where you have the vessels entering into the organ. So here, you just have the veins and the arteries. We know that the artery is coming from your celiac trunk, following the upper border of your pancreas before reaching the spleen, whereas the vein will basically follow the posterior aspect of your pancreas, which is retroperitoneal, so really buried into the organ, and it will join the portal system. So this is the one that surgeons need to be really careful when they're doing any procedures in regards to the pancreas. And the imprints, let's talk about the imprints. So just like on the liver side, so you have your transverse colon that will basically be hanging from the two hypochondriac region. So when it bifurcates to become the descending colon, it will leave a colic impression on the inferior pole of your spleen right here. So this is where your transverse colon will bifurcate and descend down, forming this little imprint right here. And you can visualize that the stomach will leave a big imprint right here. So the fundus, the posterior aspect of the fundus, what have I done? So here, we'll just leave the imprint that is on the superior aspect of your spleen. And last one will be your kidney. that will leave on the posterior side of your spleen a little imprint. So those are seen and are easily visible on the spleen. You will notice that during the lab. So the spleen is an intraperitoneal organ, and interestingly, it basically connects. It's a transition zone of peritoneum between the parietal peritoneum and the stomach. So you can recognize that here, this is the kidney. So this is your peritoneum. So your parietal peritoneum that will basically jump to the spleen to encase it, forming what we call the splenorenal ligament. So this splenorenal ligament will carry with it the vessels to the spleen. So this here is a difficult picture, although it looks simple. It's a difficult picture to understand because we're still looking at we're looking at the posterior here, the anterior, but it's a transverse cut, right? So we're looking at your patient like if it was basically going in that direction. So you have your pancreas that will just be sitting right here on the posterior aspect of your abdominal wall, and you probably remember that the body is intraperitoneal, but the tail here will be intraperitoneal. So the tail will be found in this splenorenal ligament just to twiggle the spleen right here with the vessels. So parietal peritoneum, splenorenal, spleen, kidney, splenorenal ligament. You have your visceral peritoneum that will encircle the spleen, and then it will jump to your stomach that is also intraperitoneal, so forming what we call the gastrosplenic ligament. So these are just connection between different organs, and here you will have your lesser omentum that will connect the stomach to your liver right here. So that's it. I think that we've covered everything. I'm not sure. I don't really like talking to a screen, so hopefully it was clear. If it's not, raise your questions during the next lab or during next lecture, and we'll try to make sure that everything, although, well, due to today's circumstances, so hopefully that didn't impact your learning. So otherwise, fire me emails, and have a great weekend, I guess. Okay, bye.